Well, good morning, church. I love this day of the year because we get to celebrate our seniors and all that they've done. So, yeah, so awesome. So awesome. Well, hey, let me ask you a question. How many of you have ever driven through a snowstorm before? Okay. Oh, wow. Wait, give yourselves a round of applause, California. That is good right there. I will never forget the day I drove through a snowstorm. I've driven through a few, but I'll never forget this one particular day. My brother was in the car with me. He had flown out from California to where I was going to school in Colorado to visit. We went snowboarding that day. We were coming home from the mountains on I-70 through the Rocky Mountains when it began to start snowing. And at first, it wasn't a big deal. But eventually, it began to pick up. And like all good co-pilots do, my brother fell asleep in the car on the way home, right? And so I begin driving, and we hit this one point of the road where the highway kind of comes down, and then it turns and banks up the next little hill. And as we were coming down this hill, it began to snow harder and harder. And as we kind of turned around this little bend, we saw in front of us these big, my son would call them Mack trucks, but like your 18-wheeler big rigs, right, in the middle of the road, just stop because they couldn't go anymore. And they just parked in the middle of the road. And so at that point, I was like, I do not want to get stuck on this highway. I'm going to get around these Mack trucks, right? I'm going to drive around them. So I begin to drive around them. The road is getting slippery. The car starts kind of moving like this. And of course, I was driving a really good car for the snow at that time. Very well-equipped Colorado car. It was the Volkswagen Jetta, which... not a great car for the snow, but at least it had a front-wheel drive. And as I start going up this hill, right, I start sliding, and I can feel the back of the car going this way and going that way, and I'm doing everything I can to just keep the wheels aligned to go straight. And it's at that point that my brother wakes up as the car is kind of sliding, and he goes, "Why are we sliding?" And like any good person at that time, I looked at him and I said, "Shut up," and I kept going, right? And he did, and we made it. We got up that little hill, and we got over the pass, and we came down, and by the time we got into Denver, I think it was like 75 and sunny because the weather out there is crazy. But I had to keep the wheels aligned with where I was going, right, even as things were sliding around. We all have different responses when we find ourselves in the middle of the storm. Some of you are like me. You just try to take control and yell at everybody around you. Others of you are like my brother. You just wake up in the middle of the storm and go, what the heck is going on? And some of you are just like those big rigs. You just park yourself in the middle of the storm and you go, well, somebody save me, right? And I got nothing. Today we're going to be looking at the Apostle Paul. We're still in this story about him going through this storm, eventually leading to a shipwreck, and looking at how he was able to stay aligned in the middle of the storm. If you have your Bibles, you can turn to Acts chapter 27. We're in verse 13 today. And it says this: when a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity. So they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. But before very long, a wind of hurricane force called Northeaster swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so they gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed the lee of a small island called we were able to hardly make the lifeboat secure, so the men hoisted it aboard. Then they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. Did you guys catch that? They passed ropes under the ship to try to hold it together because they were afraid they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis. They lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took a violent battering from the storm. How many of you right now are thinking like, that sounds like my life? That sounds like a violent battering from the storm. That the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard, right? This is how they're getting paid, and they're throwing it overboard just to try to stay alive. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourself this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your," what's that word? because not all of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Sorry, not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel of the God to whom I belong and to whom I serve stood before me and said, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar. And God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island." So, if you weren't here last week, basically what is going on here is that Paul and Luke, who's the author of Acts, are in transport. Paul has been arrested. They're bringing him to stand trial before Caesar. And as Caitlin and I opened this up to you last week, we said Paul was the one going, guys, it's November almost. It's not the time to sail, right? And they sailed anyway. And now Paul gets one of the biggest "I told you so" moments ever, right? He's like, "I told you not to do this." And if I were Paul in this situation, I would have been doing like my gloating parade all over them. Paul could have been yelling like, it's not just me who's going to die, it's all of us and all this kind of stuff. But he doesn't, because this angel appears to him and delivers this message to him that says, because of Paul, everyone on your ship will be saved. Paul's greater purpose is that he must stand trial before Caesar so that God's glory can be shown and the gospel can be advanced. And spoiler alert, Paul doesn't survive standing before Caesar. It ends in his death. Okay? But he's got to get there because that's part of God's greater purpose. And so because of this greater purpose, that day, everyone is saved. And now, for some of us reading this, we look at this and we look at the whole story and we go, well, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like God had this big plan and all that. But think for a second how Paul would have felt in that moment, right? Getting the news from the angel. He probably didn't feel great knowing that he was just being saved so that he could go stand trial and be killed on another day. Like if I was him, I would have been like, God, you're saving me from the frying pan, but you're just throwing me into the fire, right? Why not just kill me and everybody that made the bad decisions around me now? But instead, Paul has this greater perspective on the suffering and the pain that he's going through. He realizes that it's for the greater good of the gospel. And we actually see in the book of Romans, Paul writes a verse that we often misquote a lot that says, "And we know that in all things, God works for the purpose of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." And this is a really important verse and distinction here, because what Paul is saying is that God works all things for the good, not my good, right? And when we quote this verse and when we sing this verse, we're like, he works all things together for my good, and yeah, right? But that's not what Paul was saying. Paul was saying, no. He works all things together for the good of those who love him, right? And that last little part that we always cut off, according to his purpose. You see, when we are aligned with God's purpose, we realize that God's ultimate good is our ultimate good. Paul realized that what was bad news for him personally was actually good news for the gospel. And because his whole life and mission was the gospel, he realized that it was still good news for him. We have to stay aligned to God's purpose in our lives. Now, we're going to take a little bit of this sermon to look at what it looks like to stay aligned with God in our lives. But I want to take a moment to just talk about what happens when we're not aligned with God. You all drive cars, right? And you know that your car needs to have alignment on its tires. When your car is out of alignment, bad things happen. Your tires wear down unevenly, right? Your car starts maybe drifting to one side or another. You actually lose your fuel efficiency as you're kind of out of whack. And then it eventually can lead to a strain on the other systems in your car, like suspension and steering. The same thing is true for us in our life. When we are not in alignment with God, it begins to put some stress and some strain on our system, right? When your life is out of alignment with God's purpose, you will wear out faster, okay? You're going to experience emotional and spiritual fatigue. Some of you are like, I feel that this morning. I feel that this morning personally. I am tired. I am tired because the alarm company here called me from 12:30 to 2:30 last night, letting me know that the janitor didn't turn off the alarm when he was here. And so I'm tired this morning, right? And when we get out of alignment with what God has for our life, we just find ourselves getting to the end of our rope faster. You begin to then drift off course, right? Through compromise and confusion. When we're not in alignment with God, we drift off course. And I always tell people, listen, nobody one day goes to bed going, man, I love Jesus, and wakes up the next day and goes, I'm going to do something stupid and blow up my life, right? It doesn't happen like that. We drift off course by making these little wrong decisions along the way. We just slowly begin to drift off course. And then we end up burning more energy for less movement. We're striving without peace in our life. How many of you ever feel like this? You're like, I'm working so hard and I'm going nowhere, right? Yeah, you're just like, maybe you're not fully in alignment with what God has for you in your life right now. And then the last thing is you begin to damage other systems, which in your life is your relationships, your integrity, and your purpose, right? When you are not in alignment with what God has for you, it has this spider web effect that begins to hurt other people. I saw this yesterday. I was really trying in this sermon to not have any illustrations about my kids because I've been doing a lot of them, but they're just these walking little illustration balls, right? Like they just spit out things where I'm like, I gotta say that. So yesterday, it was a rough day, and my son, we were doing lunch, and I had heated up a leftover burrito for him, and I was prepping some other food in the kitchen, and I look over at one point, and his burrito has been dismantled, has been taken apart. It is now all over the kitchen table. His plate is on the floor. He's got his sister's plate and cups and stuff on the floor. He's just going, and I'm looking, I said, Anders, I was like, you've got to put that back together. And my hands are dirty because I'm in the middle of prepping pork and all this stuff. And I'm like, you got to put that back together. And he's like, well, Brindley threw her stuff on the floor. And I'm like, well, Brindley's a baby and you're 3.5. And like, and I'm just kind of like, just grab your burrito and eat it and stop. Right? And he's getting all upset with me, and I'm getting upset with him. And eventually I'm like, okay, and I take off my gloves, and I'm like, listen, I said, you're sitting in your chair. I said, I'm going to go put your sister down for a nap, and when I get back, we're going to talk, right? So I go put Brindley down for a nap. I come back out, and I look at him, and he's sitting in the chair, and all of a sudden now he's really sweet, right? And he goes, Dad, I don't like it when you're mean. And so I walk over to him, right, and I get down on one knee, and I'm like, Anders, I don't like it when I'm mean either. I said, but when you take your burrito and you throw it all over the kitchen and you're not listening to me, right? I was like, it makes me upset. And he goes, yeah, and when you're upset, everybody's upset. And I was like, I don't know if you're the voice of God in my life or a smart aleck little child, right? I'm like, but clearly, right, when I'm out of alignment, it's like everybody else is out of alignment as well. And it's a reminder to us, right, that when our life is not going where it's supposed to be going, it doesn't just affect us, but it affects everyone around us. And so today, we're going to be looking at a couple keys to staying aligned to God in our life, okay? Staying aligned to God. The first one is this. We have to prioritize conviction over convenience. Paul is on his way to stand trial for his life. But notice what he's doing on the boat. He's not just a prisoner in transport here. He ends up being the leader. He ends up being the guy standing up and saying, like, listen, this is what's going to happen. This is how we're going to rely on God. This is how we're going to get to my ultimate bad news. We're going to make it, though. And it says, so keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. And we see that Paul's faith is enough for the whole boat to get through this storm. And we see this in other stories in Scripture as well. In Mark chapter 2, as two friends bring a paralyzed man to Jesus. If you've heard this story before, they carry him up to the roof. They cut a hole in the roof, and they lower him down in front of Jesus because they believe that Jesus can heal him. And when it says, when Jesus saw their faith, the man was healed, and he got up and began to walk. Sometimes we've got to have faith for the people around us. They need us. There's a great story in 1939. As Nazi Germany was tightening its grip and the world began to teeter on the edge of war, a man named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a brilliant German pastor and theologian, had a chance to escape all that was going on in Germany. He had actually been one of the earliest voices in Germany to speak out against Hitler. He was part of what became known as the Confessing Church, a movement of Christians who resisted the Nazis' attempts to control the German church. And as the pressure mounted and pastors were being silenced or imprisoned or killed, Bonhoeffer's friends here in America, in New York, offered him a way out. The theologians at the Union Theological Seminary in New York extended to him a position. And so he arrived over here in the United States safely in June of 1939. And from every angle from the outside, it seemed like it was this divine rescue, right? He had influence, he had safety, and he had a chance to fight fascism from afar. But within a matter of weeks, Bonhoeffer became unsettled. He realized that his call wasn't to safety, it was to faithfulness. If he was going to have any voice in the rebuilding of Germany, he had to be there suffering with Germany in the worst. If he wanted to stand with the people who had no escape, he couldn't live in his own escape. And this is actually the second time in Bonhoeffer's life where he had fled Germany because of Hitler. He did so when Hitler was first elected. He fled to England. And at the time, his teacher and mentor and one of my favorite theologians, Karl Barth, wrote to him a letter and basically said, "What in the world are you doing in England? Your church needs you back here in Germany." And so that he eventually writes this letter to a man named Reinhold Niebuhr. He said, "I've come to the conclusion that I made a mistake in coming to America. I must live through this difficult period in our national history with the Christian people of Germany. Christians in Germany will face the terrible alternative of either willing the defeat of their nation in order that Christian civilization may survive, or willing the victory of their nation and thereby destroying our civilization. I know which of these I must choose." And so in July of 1939, Bonhoeffer gets back on a ship, sails back to Nazi Germany, knowing fully well that he could be arrested, silenced, and killed, and eventually he was, and he joined the German resistance. He helped Jews escape. And when he finally was caught, he was imprisoned and executed at the Flossenburg concentration camp in April of 1945, just weeks before the Allied troops liberated that camp. But Bonhoeffer realized that his conviction was more important than his convenience. He set his life in the middle of danger so that he could be there for his people and protect his congregation and his flock. And just like Paul in that moment, he realized that he was actually an encouragement to his church by coming back. His faith would extend to the faith of those in his church. He had this influence. And just like Paul was extending it to those in the boat in that moment, Bonhoeffer was saying, I am needed here because they need to see my faith in the middle of that. And I think when we think of storms all the time, we're often thinking about the storm that we are in. And how are we going to have faith to get through the storm that we are in? But we don't always think about, what about the storms that those around us are in? Because there are people around you in your life that need to see your faith in the middle of the storm. They need you to come alongside them and show them that you can actually get through this because of the faith that you have. Who needs your faith in your life? And as we do this, we have to do something very important, is we have to maintain our perspective, right? For Paul, the bad news was the good news. Right, that verse says, do not be afraid. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. The good news for the crew was the bad news for Paul. But Paul maintained his perspective in the middle of the storm. We get stuck sometimes being so focused on what is convenient and comfortable for us that we miss that sometimes the suffering and the pain that we go through can have a greater purpose. And notice, I think it's really, really interesting. There's a stark contrast between Paul and Jonah of the Old Testament. Okay, if you don't know the story of Jonah, Jonah was a man that God came to and said, basically, I want you to go to the city of Nineveh. I want you to tell them that they have been sinning and that they're going to be destroyed. And Jonah is like, no, I'm not doing that. And so he tries to run from God, and he gets on a ship, and the ship gets battered by the waves, and they're like, it's all Jonah's fault, and they throw him overboard, and he's eaten by a fish or a whale or whatever for 3 days and spits him out on land, and eventually he goes to Nineveh and preaches, and the whole city repents and turns back to God. But there's this clear contrast between Paul and Jonah, right? Jonah was caught in a storm because of his disobedience. Paul was caught in a storm because of his obedience. Jonah in the story goes below the deck of the ship and hides. Paul stands on the deck of the ship and leads. Jonah's presence was actually the one that endangered the sailors on the boat, and yet Paul's presence was the one that saved the sailors. We see that Jonah caused the storm by his disobedience, but Paul endured the storm by running with God. When we maintain perspective on God in our lives, we realize that the things we go through might have a greater purpose. And today I think there are 3 positive outcomes that we can learn from a storm. Some of you are like, wait, we were just on point 2 and now there's 3 points. Yes, there is. So point number 1 of point number 2 is this. When we're in the storm, we can have revelation, which means we can learn more about God in the storm. Now, in a perfect world, we would all like to believe that we can learn everything we know about God from sermons on a Sunday morning or a Bible study on a Tuesday night, right? And we walk out and we know how to apply it perfectly to our lives and everything's great. But the reality is a lot of that just becomes head knowledge for us. And actually going through storms is the opportunity for us to experience God in our lives. Because if we don't experience God, we don't know what it's actually like for him to show up. Corrie ten Boom, who was somebody who was imprisoned in the, what was the name of it? The Ravensbrück concentration camp in World War II. She said this, she said, you can never learn that Christ is all you need until Christ is all you have. And that's not like the happiest, American Christian phrase, right? Like, you're not going to walk out of here today and be like, I'm going down to the tattoo parlor, right? And I'm getting that tattooed on my arm right next to, not all who wander are lost, right? Like, girl, you are lost. Go find a therapist. But we need hard times. We need them because those hard times are the times that force us to ask the questions in life, the difficult questions. It's in the hard moments when we're finally forced to go, who am I actually trusting with my life? Right? When everything's going good, we're not really thinking about who do I need to trust with my life. When things get tough, we're like, who do I actually believe is in control? Where is God in the middle of my hurt and my suffering? Millennials, okay? I'm a millennial. This is my generation, right? We are leaving the church more than any other generation ever has. And there's a lot of theories as to why, and we can, debate that for days, whatever. But here's one thing. Millennials were given participation trophies, right? We were like, good job, you showed up. Right? That's all that you needed, right? And we never had to face what happens when I don't get the trophy? What happens when I'm actually not good enough? Who do I rely on for my identity in that moment? We didn't have to deal with that because we just walked away with these trophies saying, hey, everything's great. And so they're walking away from the church because no one has challenged them. They haven't gone through any hard times. And boomers, before you get all high on your horse, you gave us the participation trophies, okay? Gen X, I know you're in the room. A man named Frank Clark said, I have no idea who he is, but I like this quote. He said, if you find a path with no obstacles, it probably doesn't lead anywhere. Right? It's in the middle of the storms where we get to see and know and experience who God is. And the thing we have to be really wary of is not missing God in the middle of those storms. In the Old Testament, in the book of 1 Kings, there's a man named Elijah, a prophet, and he goes to listen to the voice of God. And it says, I love this story, it says, he was told to go wait to hear from God. It says, then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face, and he went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. And then a voice said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? You see, the storms in our life come and they rock us and they move us, and yet in the middle of that storm, God might be whispering to you. He might be saying to you, hey, do you see me? Do you know who I am? Can you trust me when everything else seems like it's falling apart? And yet so many of us, we get caught up in the wind and the waves, and we're throwing ropes around the boat to try to hold it together, and we miss out that God is actually whispering to us in those moments. That's the first positive outcome from storms. God reveals himself to us. The next thing is we face illumination. And what I mean by this, this isn't like some weird spiritual thing. What I mean is that we learn about ourselves in the storm, right? The crew tried to tie the boat together with rope. How many of you have ever been there in a storm before where you're like, I'm just trying to hold the boat together with every little thing I've got, right? Like, and those of us sitting here today, I know nothing about boats, but I'm like, that doesn't seem like a stable way to keep the boat from sinking, right? But it was all they had. It was the only plan that they had in that moment, was to we just got to try to keep this boat together. They've thrown everything off at this point, and they're like, we'll just try to tie it together. They did any plan they had, even if it was a bad plan, they were trying it. Mike Tyson, the great boxer, he said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth, right? Like that is life. And I've never been punched by Mike Tyson, nor do I ever want to be. But I've been punched by life before, right? We've all got a plan, and then we get punched. And it knocks us off balance. It forces us to come to terms with the fact that we made a mistake, or that we're not who we thought we were. And guys, really what this is at the end of the day is this is what the gospel does to us. Right? It's like a mirror being held up in front of us. Ladies, you probably have this in your house, but I don't. And I was at a hotel last week, and they've got those mirrors that you can see super close. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. And so we're in the bathroom, and I looked at it. I'm like, oh, I wonder what it looked like. Oh, God, right? Because it's like, whoa, that got way closer than any mirror I've ever looked at. Like the only mirror I look in the morning, and it's like hair, boom, okay, done, walk away, right? And I looked at that thing, and I'm like, you can see the pores and and it's like, this is scary stuff, right? But it is a close reflection of who I actually am. And this is exactly what the gospel does to us, is it holds up a mirror so close to our face that we're like, this is who I am. And in that moment, for those guys on the ship, they knew we're not good enough. We made a mistake, and the only one who's going to get us out of this is God. The storm illuminated for them the poor decision they had made. It revealed their shortcomings, and it showed them that their hope was only in one person, and it was God himself. When we are faced with the reality of who we are and we respond accordingly to it, it then forces us into point number 3, which is formation. We are changed by walking with God through the storm. At least that's the hope, that you learn, that you grow, that you dive in. If you stay aligned with God through the storm, it will prepare you for the amazing purpose that God has for your life. C.S. Lewis wrote, hardships often prepare ordinary people for extraordinary destiny. Do you ever think that the storm you're going through right now is training you for what's to come? This isn't in my notes, but I'll share this. I'll never forget my first internship here. I was 17 years old, in between my junior and senior year of high school. And for those of you who've been around a long time, it was 2008. And which was a very rocky year in our church history. And I remember going through that summer and what was to come, and I remember just being like, what is going on? And I remember talking to our director of student ministries at the time. Her name was Christy. And I looked at her and I said, what scares me the most about this is that if God is teaching me with this storm at 17, what is he preparing me for the rest of my life? And I've come to experience a little bit of what God was doing in that moment, right? But the storms we go through can be formative and transforming for where we're going in our future, to be able to do bigger things. I would not be the person I am today, up here today, without the storms I've gone through in the past. I saw another story play out like this week. I'm going to embarrass one of my students here a bit. I didn't give him really any warning of this, so sorry, not sorry to him. But on Friday night, I went and I watched Cooper Schultz. He plays drums here sometimes. Play in the league championship game, Annalee against Montgomery. Some of our Montgomery students were there playing as well. And if you read the paper yesterday, you would have seen that Cooper threw a perfect game through 6 innings and a no-hitter and got the win through 7, which was awesome. It was the coolest thing ever. Cooper, I've been mentoring him for the last 4 years. He's been part of our D team, and I've been his mentor, and I've been to 2 of Cooper's games already this year, and both times I showed up, he did not play well. And so really, the whole time Friday, I'm worried that I'm the jinx, right? Like, I go, he's going to blame this on me if this game doesn't go well. And here's the thing, as we're watching the game go by, inning by inning, out by out, I'm looking at the mound, and I'm seeing Cooper, and I'm not just seeing this senior starting pitcher for the biggest game of the season, right? I'm seeing him. Oh, man. And I'm remembering the 8th grader that I met, right? He was much shorter, had way less muscles than he does now. I'm remembering all the times that we've sat at Mexican restaurants eating food, talking about life and God and the struggles he's going through. And as he walks out onto the mound in the 7th inning, we all know he's got a perfect game on his hands, and because sports jinxes are real, none of us are saying a word about it, right? We're all just looking at each other with the kind of look. And in my head, I go to the worst case scenario. I'm thinking all it takes is 2 hits, and they could lose the game. There goes his perfect game, his no-hitter, his shutout, all those things. He could lose the championship after having a perfect 6 innings. And I'm thinking that would be devastating, absolutely devastating. And then I thought to myself, I go, but you know what? If that happens, I know he's going to be okay. Because I've watched him go through challenges and adversity over the last 4 years. I've watched him struggle and wrestle with the different coaches he's had and the teachers and the grades he's been wrestling with. I've watched him wrestle with me and the difficulties that we've had, right? And I've watched him balance life and baseball, church and sports. I've watched him come from practice on a Wednesday night to rush over here to run up on stage and help lead us in worship. I've seen his character in the toughest moments be tried and tested, and I've watched as he stayed aligned to what God has for him. All of those moments have formed him into the man he is in that moment as he walks out onto the mound in the 7th inning. And I texted him after the game and I said, Coop, it is a joy to watch a man of character who has been formed over the years get to experience a moment like that. You deserve it more than anybody else. He only got there because of the struggles and the twists and the turns. And he said, I'm going to stay aligned to what God has for me. If we're able to stay aligned to God in the stormiest seasons, then we get to see the joys that come from remaining aligned with him. Because at the end of the day, God is the one who is in full control of your life. Remember that the good news for the boat was actually bad news for Paul. Instead of Paul perishing at sea, he was delivered to Caesar. He was eventually beheaded. Spoiler alert for the next couple chapters. But his end ultimately leads to the gospel being advanced to the world and beyond. think to yourself right now, where are you in the middle of the storm? Are you like the guys on the boat and you've got the rope and you're trying to hold everything together yourself and you're realizing that you can't really do anything? Or are you in a moment of full surrender to the will of God? I want to close with this prayer. I'm going to invite you, church, would you just stand up? I found this prayer online. You guys have heard me pray a lot, so I thought it'd be better to read somebody else's prayer. Do me a favor, take your hands, just open them up in front of you. Close your eyes, bow your head. This is the international symbol of surrender. And I don't know where each of you are at right now in your life and the storms you're going through, but I pray that you could pray this prayer. Lord, you are the calm in the midst of my storm. I trust you are at work and walking toward my rescue. There is no storm that you are not fully in control of, and I can trust the outcome will be your glory and my good. Lord, teach me to have faith. You are bringing me through to the other side with greater wisdom. Give me strength to endure and patience as the waves crash over me. You are my protector. Help me shift my perspective and bring you glory as you heal my pain. I am reaching out, Lord. Take my hand. Give me the humility to surrender and the grace to grow in intimacy with you. You are forever faithful. I will trust your grace is sufficient even in this trial. In Jesus' name, amen. Church, let's worship together.